Identification. This is Nancy Robinson of Mananuri in the Northern Highlands of South Australia, introducing a tape which is a recording of the inaugural meeting of the South Australian Historical Society. I believe it may be the first recording filed away for posterity by the Society. The fidelity of this cassette recording leaves much to be desired. I wasn't able to plug my recorder into the PA system because I'd forgotten to take my accessory for that, and I was also unable to plug the recorder into a PowerPoint because my lead wasn't long enough, and there seemed to be no extension cord handy, so I had to record it on batteries some distance from the speakers. And the recording really wasn't meant to be anything than just for my own use. However, as there weren't any other recorders in action at the very crowded meeting, I'm donating this tape as a sound backing, as it were, to the official minutes of the occasion. There was a pleasing feeling of camaraderie at the meeting, a warmth and an optimism which was very contagious. Ron Gibbs, who chaired the meeting, did so with impeccable charm, and the formal meeting was followed by a very informal gathering over coffee and biscuits. As usual, everybody there mingled happily despite the lateness of the hour. In fact, the only complaint was that people didn't have time to say over coffee all the things they wanted to say to each other. The organisation by the steering committee was complimented on all sides. And to sum up what the average person there felt about the whole thing, in the words of the current vernacular, it was a happening. This, then, is the sound recording of the inaugural meeting of the South Australian Historical Society, held in the National Gallery of South Australia on Friday, 19th July, 1974. End of identification.
A Historical Society of South Australia. First, let me apologise to you for any last-minute confusion over the decision to have this meeting here rather than in the Historical Museum, which was, of course, the announced venue for this meeting. I assure you that this decision was made with the best of motives, and that is your own comfort. The Historical Museum, of course, is not the largest of places, nor indeed on a night like this is the warmest. So I hope that any redirection of you downstairs met with your approval. The Historical Museum is, of course, a very appropriate venue for a meeting such as this, and at the end of this meeting it will be open to you. Before making any further remarks, I should say that this meeting has inevitably clashed with other meetings, and a number of people have been unable to attend. The list of those who've sent apologies is rather long, and I won't read them all. But I should mention that apologies have been received from the Premier, Mr Hudson, the Leader of the Opposition, Dr Eastick, the Minister of Education, Mr Hudson, the Minister of Environment and Conservation, Mr Broomhill, the Minister of Development and Mines, Mr Hopwood, and the federal member for Wakefield, Mr Kelly. I should also mention, I think, the apology tendered to this meeting by Sir Archibald Renfrew Price and his good wishes for tonight's meeting. A number of others, including the President and members of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria, have also sent good wishes for this meeting. We're most pleased, however, to welcome Mr John Tregenza, Deputy Leader of the Opposition, a great number of members of councils, members of departments and of other societies. To those too who have travelled considerable distances to attend this meeting, may I extend a special welcome. I don't want to speak too long at this stage, but certain things should be explained to you. This is not the meeting of a fully fledged society, but a meeting called by a steering committee to form a society. My name is Ron Gibbs. With me is John Colley on my right and Ryan Samuels on his right. Together, the three of us constitute a steering committee elected by a small group of people who met first in February of this year to discuss the formation of a state historical society. Brian Samuels convened that meeting, and it was he who took the initiative in bringing the group together. From the discussions came the decision to form a steering committee to launch a society. The intended aims of the society? The steering committee saw these as A, to arouse interest in and promote the study and discussion of South Australian and Australian history, to promote the collection, preservation and classification of source material of all times relating to South Australian and Australian history. C, to publish historical records and articles. D, to promote interchange of information among members of the Society by lectures, readings, discussions and exhibitions. E, to cooperate with similar societies throughout Australia. F, to do all such other things as are conducive to or incidental to the attainment of the above objects, or to any one of them. You will find these, of course, printed on the back of the sheet, giving you information of the further meetings. I hope these statements will explain to you what kind of society this one will be. The steering committee has also arranged 2 further meetings. 2 general meetings, one in September and one in November, and a special business meeting on Wednesday, September the 4th, not on September the 3rd as previously notified, to consider a constitution for the society and the election of a committee. There will be no such business at tonight's meeting, but the September the 4th meeting will be devoted solely to these matters. I invite you to attend that meeting, but realise that the remaining 2 general meetings on the depression of the 1920s and 1930s in South Australia and on the history of Hindmarsh, both with a minimum of business, should prove much more attractive. I urge you to come to them. Details of all meetings will be found on the leaflets available to you. And would you please mention these meetings to other people? We've made every effort to advertise this meeting as widely as possible, and feel sorry that there must be some who would have come tonight had they known about the meeting. Perhaps you can help us reach those people and assure them of our apologies and of our anxiety to include all people who support the aims already outlined in the activities of the Society. This last point must be emphasised. It's been strongly felt that the Society should be as much for amateur historians as for professional historians, as much perhaps for a person who has limited time and a beginning interest for historical things, as for a person who is writing his second doctoral dissertation. It should be a society too for those who accept the proposition that thorough understanding of any aspect of history, however local, aids the understanding of every other, however grand. Let me conclude by stating the following conviction too. It is surely time that this state had a strong, central historical society, as found in every other state. Such a society could provide an avenue of expression for all the historical interests of this community. Such a society would support others engaged in similar work. Such a society could be a valuable watchdog over the historical estate, barking strongly when unthinking people seek to destroy it before our eyes. And such a society could help every person interested in history add richness to his own life and that of others. Ladies and gentlemen, I now have pleasure in asking Dr. John Tregenza, Reader in History at the University of Adelaide, to move the motion that a historical society be formed and speak to that motion. Dr. Tregenza needs little introduction. He has himself supervised the work of many research students in South Australian history and in Australian history, South Australia's past. I should like to thank him at this stage too for standing in so readily for Mr. Hopwood, who's fallen victim to the flu and unable to propose the motion as planned. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Tregenza.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honour and a pleasure to move to the Historical Society of South Australia be formed. I felt the need for such a society, as many of you will have, for some years. At different times, I've talked with Brian Samuel about the student line. I think we all stand in debt to him and to the chairman, Mr. Colley, taking the initiative to act now. Society won't just happen. People have to get together and spend many hours making plans to reach the position of marriage, where it's possible for publicly to take the necessary formal steps. If you will support this motion, we can then, as members, go ahead to plan its functions and policies. All of us can see the society from our own particular background. We live in different places, we have different ages, we have different occupations. I see the possibilities of the society, particularly from the point of view of the universal picture, which is concerned with which they've supervised a number of theses over the past 11 years on South Australian history. The probably come to some scores. This is one of the things that has concerned me, that so much work is being done by students in my university and other tertiary institutions. They work very hard, they come up with interesting findings, they're put into types of theses, which are deposited in libraries and in departmental cupboards, and primarily read by fellow students. And there's a lot of material in those theses, which may be of interest to a much wider audience. Only a very few have found their way into print in the form of an article. Mr. Don Hopwood, who was to have moved this motion, wrote a big A thesis some years back in my department on land labour in South Australia. Hopwood wrote a thesis some years back on land labour in South Australia in the interwar years. So it was quite an interesting write on the Labor Party at that time. And he did publish an article derived from the thesis in the Canberra journal Labour History. But even here, there'll probably be many in this meeting who wouldn't know of its existence. It may have been better still if it had been published in a local journal. I'm hoping that the new Historical Society of South Australia could play the same sort of role that the Royal Geographical Society is currently playing in the field of geography, in enabling good theses, good research work by students and by others in the community to be heard by a wider audience through lectures or to be read in a journal. Such a journal could only publish articles, but could help keep all those interested in South Australia in touch through accounts of local historical societies, reviews of books on South Australian history, lists of any important findings and papers, what's going on in the way of historical exhibitions and so on. It's very interesting to see so many people here tonight as a testimony to the fact that there is this community in South Australia, quite a wide community, who are not up till now being brought in touch with one another and with their own work and interests. Just today I was looking at local and regional history journals in the Bathurst Library, and I was most impressed with the monographs published by the Newcastle and Hunter Valley Historical Society, quite substantial since 1966, in conjunction with the Newcastle City Council. Well, if the Hunter Valley can do it, surely the state of South Australia can publish a journal. I think with Mr. Gibbs that the proposed society could fill an important role of acting as an organised voice on matters of historical importance. He mentioned the preservation of buildings of historical interest. Just the other day I had a phone call from a member of the executive of the National Trust asking me whether I could recommend some people who might be consulted about the value of buildings when the National Trust classifies them. Up to date, the tendency has been for architects and only architects to be consulted, and that the judgment is made on the aesthetic appearance of the building very largely. I think, as an example here of the cottage homes to be aged in Stanley Street, which had, I think, a C classification of the National Trust, not high priority, on the grounds that there weren't particular architectural interests, but to me, as a historian, they were of very great interest as the first cottage homes, in all probability, of their kind in Australia. The first homes to offer to the aged, poor and widows the chance of a civilised, dignified life in small apartments or 2 rooms, which was the only alternative they had to living in a barracks of the destitute asylum up here in Kintore Avenue. Segregation of the sexes. Now this was a very important innovation in Australian history. Interestingly enough, they called them cottage homes and not almshouses, though they're being called almshouses today. It has a better sort of tone about it. But they deliberately rejected almshouses because it was felt to have a sort of connotation of condescension about it. As it is, there's a plaque put on the wrong building there saying it was built in the 1870s. It was unveiled by the governor. In fact, that particular building was built in the 1880s. This is where a history society could provide consultants who might make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen. And in that particular case, as in others, I think such a society as this proposed one might see that a plaque is put at the front, giving a little bit of the history of the building. I think the listing and preservation of records is also another matter on which a society like this can have a voice. Records exist in the most surprising places. Very few would probably know that there are interesting diaries and letters of South Australians who served in the Boer War down in the Largs Police Academy. They were simply donated to the Police Academy, and there they are. But unless they're listed, people interested in that field of history won't go there. There's a great need to preserve papers which are being destroyed. Professor Luca of the Law School has told me of his great distress that valuable papers of the Law Society of South Australia were destroyed not so long ago because there seemed to be no way of looking after them. We don't have business archives in South Australia, trade union archive, particularly collecting trade union records. The tendency has been for Canberra, the ANU, or the National Library, or the business archives of Melbourne University to come over and collect these and take them away. For example, the papers of the very South Australian firm of Elder Smith are now in Canberra. I think where papers do get taken away, we should press to have them copied, photocopied, and these copies deposited in South Australia. I think we should be concerned too, we could be concerned as an organisation with the preservation and the seeking out of historic films on South Australia. I've very recently seen some made by Harry Krishock. Only a few of them though. He made about 44 between 1911 and 1925. Do they still exist or don't they? The ones I saw are very interesting. There are other films in the 1920s made by the South Australian government. Very interesting documentary films. Unique as far as I know. And it would only require a matter of $1,100 to copy permanently. And that seems to me a matter of high priority for a body such as this to make sure that this irreplaceable record is preserved. And also in the field of oral history, a new field, a growing field, I think we can encourage people to tape record interviews with those who have valuable memory. So much history just exists in people's minds. It never gets written down and it dies with people. And I think there's a lot to be said for fostering what is very common in the United States now, a collection of oral history in South Australia. Above all, such a society could encourage others to take an interest in all matters historic. Individuals, teachers, local councils, governments. And it could lead the people of South Australia to discover how interesting their own history can be. I commend the motion.
Thank you, Dr. Tregenza. I'd like to call on Mrs. Nancy Robinson, known for her interest in history, for her radio work, for her books, Change on Change, Bend Down and Listen, Stag of Tarcowie and Pippity, to second the motion and to speak to it.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, after such learned gentlemen, I feel like the puppy dogs at the Sunday school picnic. My interest in South Australian history began at a very early age because my father had written a little leaflet, almost, we call it these days. This was back in the 1930s. And it had been printed by a local printer, as in those days, of course, there were many local printers scattered throughout the countryside. And it was selling, I think, for 2 shillings and 6 pence. There was no distributor, no publisher. And Nancy, in pigtails and on a bicycle, set out to comb the district as sales representative, distributor, public relations officer, and what have you. And I think I was aged about 8 at the time. And then
suppose through my father's interest, I retained a certain connection with it, but I went through a period of being more interested in scientific things, as I suppose a lot of people do in their teens. And it wasn't until I was in my, well, I suppose in my 30s that I began to be actively interested again. Of course, I didn't live in that era, in the era of the nostalgia boom that we're enjoying today. And long may the nostalgia boom last, because I feel that Australia is coming of age now, when we are not self-conscious about our past, when we are proud of our past and we're wanting to record it. I would agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Tregenza that so much is being lost through the people. And to me, history is basically people. And I find that it's no good just asking a person to record something. You would realise that it needs somebody to just trigger off the right memory, to ask the right questions. So often when I go to people, they say, I haven't got anything to tell you. I don't know why you come to me. But you have a cup of tea with them, you have a little chat with them, and quietly you turn on the tape recorder. And you just ask those few little leading questions which seem to come to you, and it triggers off something in the archives of their own minds. And that is where the treasure of our history lies, as well as in all the repositories of the more academic history. I would see the proposed society acting as something of a liaison, and I'm sure this is how the architects of this society, those three very brave men who set out to be the steering committee, I would imagine that's how they saw it too, as being something of a liaison between the amateur historians and those beginning to be interested, and the professionals like Dr. Tregenza and like Mr. Gibbs himself. Because at present and in the past there has been a gap somewhere where it's very hard to find out, to start to find material. And in my very humble way, I find that I'm being inundated with inquiries from people starting off on family research. And it's taking up a lot of my time. And as we have a representative of the government here tonight, I would like to say, sir, that if at some time the government would see its way clear to make a grant to a society of this sort, so that perhaps an information officer or a liaison officer could be appointed in a part-time capacity to help new chums and tell them where to go for the right material. Because I'm sure there are many of us here tonight who are being overtaxed in the little bit of information and knowledge that we have, being overtaxed by the districts and the people surrounding us, asking us where do we go for information, how do we start, and a million other questions which we're happy to give but we really haven't time to give. And I would hope that perhaps the society will in time be able to afford to appoint an information officer, or call it what you like, but somebody to act in that capacity where the community at large would know that it could go for information. Therefore, as an amateur historian, I have very much pleasure in seconding the motion that an historical society of South Australia be formed.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the motion that the society be formed. The motion is, of course, really a resolution of this meeting. I now put it to you and ask you to vote by show of hands. Those in favour? And those against? Carried unanimously. In passing this motion, the meeting has, of course, indicated its support for such a society. The motion or resolution, of course, will have further effect at the business meeting on September the 4th, when a constitution is discussed and a committee elected. This day it is my very pleasant duty to introduce to you Dr. Eric Richards, Reader in Economic History at the Flinders University of South Australia. Dr. Richards graduated from Nottingham University in 1972 and took his doctorate in that university, should I have said, in 1962, and took his doctorate in that university in 1967. He's lectured in history at the University of Stirling in Scotland and has published numerous articles on Scottish Highland clearances and other subjects. Two of his publications denote wide interest in his field. One is his book, The Leviathan of Wealth, The Sutherland Fortune in the Industrial Revolution. The other, an article, Women in the British Economy since 1700, an interpretation. But Dr. Richards has interests closer to us. In the mid-1960s, he was a tutor and lecturer in economics at the University of Adelaide, and since 1971 has held appointments in the economic history discipline at Flinders University. He is working on the history of the South Australian economy since 1830, including the genesis of secondary industry in South Australia to 1876. However, the Highlands won't let him go. He's working on a new history of the Highland clearances as well. That fascination for things Scottish, you see, and its modern adherents as well as its former ones in South Australia. And I believe the Scots asked him too to address an inaugural meeting of a historical society there some years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richards, his subject, History from Below.
Very much. Well, it seems to me that this new historical association, this brand new historical association, would become the type of place in which several different sorts of historians would collect together. Local historians particularly, of course, but also economic historians, archivists, historians of different communities, family historians, legal historians, marine archaeologists, art historians, historical geographers, and so on. And indeed anyone else concerned with the practice of history. I thought it might be useful to report on some of the recent developments in a particular and rather influential branch of social history this evening. I think social history, it can be said, has in the last 10 years been revitalised to an extraordinary degree. The new social history is emerging, built on quite venerable foundations, which has important things to say to other labourers in the historical vineyard. But beyond this, and this is the main theme of my talk this evening, this new work in social history has much to say to society at large, particularly in the way in which society, like South Australian society, sees its own self-identity. Now, history, of course, has always had a very large audience. Unlike most other academic disciplines, history is able to appeal simultaneously to the professional, to the student, and to the so-called general public. The audience for history, spoken, written, filmed, televised, fictionalised, is enormous. And the producers of history, historical writing, are also very heterogeneous. Some of the most effective historical work, in my opinion, is done by journalists, novelists, and enthusiastic local historians, possessing special expertise in their own areas. So history is extremely popular. Embarrassingly large numbers of students, for instance, wish to read history in universities throughout the English-speaking world. History is also lucrative, because there's very big money to be made in history writing. The range of published titles in history is astonishing, and even relatively obscure historical scholarship sells really quite well. For instance, volumes in the Pelican History of England sell every year about 20,000 copies each, and there's virtually no advertising from the publisher for those volumes. At one time, a few years ago, a volume in the Oxford History of England was selling more copies than that other Oxford bestseller, the Bible. I think it sold 30,000 copies in 3 months. So there's a huge audience for history, and a very great fund of goodwill for history. I think that shows this evening was a splendid turnout. Well, against this very happy background, there are current developments in historical scholarship which are pulling, I think, in the opposite direction. For instance, a great deal of economic history is now becoming very technical and exceedingly difficult and unpleasant to read. Econometric techniques, esoteric theory, computerized calculations are producing history which can have little to say to the conventional audience of historians. Much the same can be said of certain types of sociological and demographic history currently flowing out, floods of it, from the universities. It's becoming specialized, very academic, very obscure territory in which the reader is quite likely to become lost up statistical creeks and down sociological quagmires. One critic of this type of history has offered the rather jaundiced comment that it is now possible to write history that is in no way human. Many economic historians, he says, have demonstrated just how this can be done. And he goes on to contrast economic historians with human historians. Now, as an economic historian myself, I find that a little extreme, but I must say it does contain a kernel of truth. This sort of history, this very technical sort of history, will not have a wide leadership and will have little directly to say to society. But in contrast to this, there's a new variety of social history, particularly that part of social history which is now being called history from below, which is my main subject this evening, which is quite different. In the last few years, there's arisen a strong demand that historians devote themselves to this style of history, this is called history from below. And the demand comes particularly, notably, from the new left. First in Britain, then in the United States, and also in Australia now. Origins can be found back into the 19th century. I think the real beginnings of this type of history can be found better in the 1900s. However, the main emergence has been in the last 10 years. Its primary impulse, I think, the main motivation behind this sort of scholarship, has been, in part, a radical critique of orthodox scholarship in historical writing. And some of the best work in the field comes directly from that source, which was being a critique of orthodox scholarship. To me, the general approach is a very healthy one and a very progressive development in modern historiography. What I intend to do is to offer a critical report on this brand of history from below, by way of first a definition, then some examples, some episodes from South Australian history, and South Australian experience, and then some indications of the kinds of problems involved in this sort of history, and finally some remarks about the significance of history from below, for history in general. Well, first of all then, definition, what's meant by all of this. And for definition, I've looked through various of the manifestos of the protagonists of this style of history. Well, the founding father of this style of history is generally taken to be the great French historian Georges Lefebvre. He wrote that the essential problem in historical research is, I quote, to determine precisely the views, interests, sentiments, and above all the mental content of the popular classes. And French historians have pioneered studies of this collective psychology of the peasantry and the working classes of France in French history. And it is, of course, a reaction, this type of history, a reaction against the conventional preoccupations of historians. Conventional preoccupations with the ruling elites in society, with rulers and power elements in society, to the neglect of the great majority of the people. It's also a reaction against the view which, for instance, regarded peasants as internal barbarians about whom little was known, knowable, or even worth knowing. It attempts to get away from stereotypes of the common people, who are quite often in historical works regarded as the mob. As Australian historian F.B. Smith says, the common people until recently were regarded by historians as inarticulate beasts of burden, or anonymous mob rioters. They were denied moral purpose or even recognition. The common people were in effect non-persons to historians. Only now they begin to emerge as essential people in historical processes, as rational participants rather than marginal and picturesque victims of history. One of Lefebvre's disciples, Georges Roudet, who of course was in Adelaide for many years, Georges Roudet defines history from below as, I quote, focusing attention on the nameless and faceless people in history. And the common man has, under this influence, begun to appear as an historical figure in his own right. It's an attempt to treat history from the level of the peasant's cottage, the craftsman's shop, or the prisoner in the dock, or the rioter in the streets. It moves away from the view of the common people as the inert and docile mass, as cannon fodder, or as obedient sheep. The people, in effect, the people at large, the masses, become, to quote Roudet again, an active agent in the historical process. Under the influence of this approach, particularly in French history recently, the peasantry and the urban sans-culottes have been brought into the picture and studied from below as social classes and groups having their own identity ideas and aspirations independent of those of the upper and middle bourgeoisie. And I don't think anyone would deny that this scholarship, this type of approach in the last few years, in practice, has had the most positive effects on our entire understanding of, for instance, the French Revolution. American historians employ rather different phrases, rather picturesque phrases. They talk about the underside of history and history from the bottom up. One notes of his approach that the traditional emphases have been abandoned. The stress is on the failings of the system. The focus is not on the victors, but on the victims of history. The result, of course, is not a balanced view of history, but an attempt to redress the existing imbalance of conventional history. Another American historian remarks that the old history ignored large segments of the population, or else subjected them to stereotyping. The consequence was that American social history became an index of the upper middle class standards and values. Social problems were rendered from the perspective of the leader or the caretaker. Another manifesto asserts that it is the role of the democratic historian to write the history of the people and to challenge the conception of uneducated masses waiting placidly for manipulation by educated men. The most trenchant American writer in this vein is a man called Jesse Lemisch, who remarks that many historians continue to draw conclusions about entire societies on the basis of examinations of the minority at the top. And this approach has distorted our view and sometimes cut us off from past reality. He points out that elites are used as surrogates for the entire society beneath them, and it leaves unexplored the entire history of non-dominant cultural groups. Quite rightly, I think, he points out that this procedure, looking at society only in terms of the minority elite, is grossly unscientific as a picture of that society, and makes a mockery of our pretensions as historians and as to be social scientists. The new approach requires no less than a history of the inarticulate. As Lemisch points out, the history of the powerless, the history of the inarticulate, the poor, has not yet been written because they have been treated no more fairly by historians than they have been treated by their own contemporaries. Of course, all of this has been a reaction against the old tradition of historiography, which is branded by this style of historian as elitist. The powerful tradition of British historical writing, which developed at Oxford in the 1850s and remains a conventional mode of thinking, has been criticised strongly by members of this new school of social history. In the old tradition, it said history was conventionally interpreted as the interaction between great men and the institutions they created, modified, or resisted. History was past politics, a celebration of the rise in Britain of liberal Britain. Charles Kingsley used to lecture at Oxford on the theme of heroism, and his object of that was admirable inspiration for his students. He hoped the students would go out into the world and imitate the actions of historical heroes. There was little place for the people in this conception of history, or indeed for the study of social processes. I think a mild expression of this rather critical view of orthodox scholarship came recently in the remarks of Hartley Grattan on that great enterprise, the Australian Dictionary of Biography. He said recently in a review, what is missing in this great enterprise, the Australian Dictionary of Biography, what is missing here, he says, is any specific reference to the environing crowd, the common people who provide the context for the more celebrated to move up in society. Well, one thing is clear, I think, and that is that it's not merely the subject matter that defines history from below. It is expressly, specifically, history from a particular viewpoint, a specific conception of the process of historical change. Charles Tilly offers this definition, that he's trying to trace the experience and actions of large numbers of ordinary men from their own point of view, It produces, he says, a richer, rearranged picture of life over the last few centuries. Roudet says that we should get inside the skulls of ordinary people, individually and in terms of the collective psychology of the crowd. Richard Cobb, another historian of the French Revolution, talks about allowing people to speak for themselves in order to place historical events in their human perspective and to add a new dimension to history. To understand an historical event, such as a riot, says Cobb, it's necessary to get into the head of the rioter, to follow him home, into every detail of his life. The question I think arises just how much of that is rhetoric and how much is operational, how much is possible in practice as a historical method. The last historian I want to quote in terms of definition, the last historian from this brief anthology, is the most eloquent of the historians from below, the English historian E.P. Thompson. He produced what I consider to be the most resounding and single phrase in all historical writing of the 1960s, when he referred to the enormous condescension of history, which consigned to oblivion the obsolete tandem weaver, the poor Stoppinger, the utopian artisan, and all the other casualties of 19th century history. The enormous condescension of history, of conventional history, that is to say. Thompson is notably critical of existing orthodoxies, which, for example, see working people in the 19th century as passive victims of laissez-faire, or as components of the labour force, and as data for a statistical series, or as significant only as forerunners of modern industrial relations. He wants to see the history of the common people in its full complexity, for its own sake, and for what it can tell us about the past in terms of social processes and the perspective thereon. Most of all, Thompson wants to illuminate the positive agency of working people, the degree to which they contributed by conscious efforts to the making of history. Like many others, Thompson wants to widen the basis of later history towards a diversified view of working class life, taking in such areas as work discipline amongst working people, sexual mores, religion, temperance movements, the comparative sociology of labour adaptation, popular culture and folklore. This and much more, said Thompson, can be called the moral economy of the working class, attention to which would broaden the whole basis of social history. Well, I think I can mention here that these tendencies implicit in history from below have spread to other areas of historical writing, away from merely the French Revolution and British working class history in the early 19th century. They've spread, for instance, to archaeology, as far as I can tell. Even archaeology has been affected. In Britain, we're told that about recent shifts in archaeological thought, where the emphasis is no longer on the reconstruction of invasions, battles, and major political events, but on the long-term processes of change in the economy and in society. That's in archaeology. In colonial history, analogous trends have been developing. For instance, in Indian history, the history of the Indian subcontinent, there's been a historiographical revolution. Quote, the European viewpoint has monopolized the historical perspective. Away towards an ethnocentric perspective. The European-dominated view of Pacific history. And a colleague of mine at Flinders, historian, calls this kind of history from the veranda, the conventional view of Pacific history. Increasingly, therefore, Pacific history is becoming indigenous history, and it performs an interesting role, I think, according to its subscribers. The new history has a very practical and therapeutic role, we're told, to enact in assisting the rehabilitation of Pacific peoples at the end of a traumatic era of European political, economic, and technological ascendancy, by renewing the self-respect of the Pacific peoples and providing them with a secure historical base from which to play their part as responsible citizens of independent countries in the New World. I think the reasons offered by historians from below for their style of history are very interesting and provocative. The practitioners, on the whole, tend to be rather more open and explicit about their motivations in tackling history from this viewpoint. For instance, one American historian says that the purpose of the new style of history is to demolish the consensus continuity historiography of American history by showing the achievements of radical individuals in the past, and to help present-day radicals by analysing reasons for the past failures of radicals. Another says it will offer a harsher view of American history in order to counterbalance the orthodox complacency of present-day American life. E.P. Thompson says that his own work shows that the plebeian movement in 19th century England placed an exceptionally high valuation on egalitarian and democratic values, and as a consequence, his works will reinforce present-day democratic traditions. History from below, therefore, for Thompson and for others, is inspirational in its function. The experience of the British working class provides lessons ends with the sentence after 800 pages. We may thank them, the English working class, we may thank them for these years of heroic culture. It's clearly inspirational in its thrust. Barrington Moore, an American historian at this time, echoes these thoughts as an essential ideology of the historian. He writes, for all students of human society, sympathy with the victims of historical processes and skepticism about the victor's claims provides essential safeguards against being taken in by the dominant mythology of our own times. According to this, to be objective, the historian requires these feelings of sympathy with the people below. I think these definitions and thoughts provide stimulus and provocation. But there are practical and philosophical difficulties with history from below, and I'll enumerate some of those which occur to me. Firstly, I'm not personally prepared to dismiss all pre-George III history as history from above, although I would concede that there is a marked, and there has been a marked preponderance in that direction towards emphasis on the elite, the ruling elites in history. But the tradition in Britain, for instance, of the Hammonds, the Webbs, Cole and Tawney must be recognised as part of this type of history. And so also must be a quite substantial amount of 19th century writing, particularly at the local history level in the 19th century. Other roots of history from below, I think, can be found in the nationalist movements of Central Europe in the 19th century. Apparently in the folk traditions of Poland, Eastern Europe, Denmark and even Scotland, one can find traces of this style of history. It helped at that time, mid-19th century, to create a respect for indigenous folk culture as opposed to the imperial article, and thereby reinforced mid-19th century nationalism. So I think the roots of history from below really ought to be recognised. Secondly, I think it is perfectly possible to write the history of elites and powerful individuals without necessarily identifying with the ideology of that elite or that individual. Thirdly, I think that history from below ought to be seen essentially as a corrective rather than a substitute for orthodox history. Its function must be to complement other varieties of history. If all history became history from below, we simply produce the reverse bias of elite history. Fourthly, I think the notion that history from below can be reduced to merely letting the people speak for themselves is very difficult to visualize in practice. Some oral historians, for instance, seem to believe that spontaneous expression of ordinary people will produce history. I think this is a little naive. The historian will never avoid the task of interpreting the evidence before him, whether it's oral or written or whatever. And history of historians from below cannot escape this imperative. On the positive side, it seems to me to be self-evident that we cannot consider the study of society without a proper consideration of the great masses of the people as individuals and as interacting groups. Even the study of power in society in the past, in its most concentrated form, requires systematic reference to the manner in which the exercise of power was received. How power was received and assimilated by the people. As I say, the sources of deference, assimilation, and as well as resistance among the ordinary people, the common people. Riots, the study of riots in 19th century Europe, throws a great deal of light on the mechanisms of established power, for instance. F.B. Smith adds a further justification. He notes that many creative ideas in society actually originate with the people and are often impeded for many years by political leaders. He said, for instance, that the notion that some creative ideas have filtered upwards is a prime justification for writing the history of the common people. Ideas about the human potentialities of social planning, fairness in social relations, the malleability of institutions, the need for education, the worth of individual liberties, all these things were all discussed among common people in Britain, Australia, and America before the rulers adopted or conceded these principles. And that's, I think, a powerful, compelling reason for studying history from below, amongst many others. But beyond all this, I think there are great problems of evidence and interpretation. Until about 1850, virtually everywhere, most peasants and proletarians were illiterate. And in any case, the working class tended not to commit its thoughts to paper very much, if at all. And indeed, history from below is defined as the history of the inarticulate. Thus, history from below is unwritten history, which is close to a contradiction.
concerned. Almost invariably it comes to rely on indirect evidence. As F.B. Smith points out, the historian is dependent upon generalized reports from outside witnesses, sanitary inspectors, policemen, clergymen, lady visitors, none of them sharing the values or experience of their subjects. Further than this, it can lead to some over-enthusiastic historians speaking on behalf of the lower orders, the lower classes, without adducing first-hand evidence. It leads some historians to extrapolate their own feelings to the working classes. Richard Cobb, I mentioned it earlier, Richard Cobb is quite blatant about doing this. When the evidence is insufficient, he says, I quote, I've not been afraid to fall back on my imagination. To do some of the thinking of the common people for them. A certain amount of guesswork, and imaginative guesswork is indispensable, he said. And then he goes on. Imagines. In extreme cases, the frustration of the historian from below can induce him to fabricate dialogue between peasants and attribute certain attitudes to the people without direct evidence. In other words, there may be powerful temptations towards very unscholarly, very peculiar history writing, very imaginative, fictionalized history writing. Well, those are some of the problems that I see with this approach. The history of South Australia, I think, and the history writing of South Australia is really a fine example of the preponderance of an older and respected style of historical writing. Almost all the histories of this colony, and I generalise badly now, almost all the histories of this colony and state have been commentaries on the founding fathers, on the men of capital, who pioneered large-scale agricultural and pastoral activity, on premiers, on lord mayors, on religious leaders, on business leaders, and industrialists. Obviously, these worthy people must be studied and must be understood in the history of South Australia. But it's very much the great man view of history, concerned with particularly the impact of Southern English middle-class culture and the celebration of its leaders and its constitutional experiments from Angus to Dunstan. Now, I don't wish to deny the value of all of this, but I wish to argue that South Australian history can be much more than that, more than the story of its elite. I believe we really ought to consider this a society that was in creation during those 130 years, and also the people of South Australia who've been passed over rather neglectfully. I think it's significant that the most distinguished and the most widely acclaimed history of the colony of South Australia contains virtually nothing on the existence of 95% of the population, little on the actual living conditions and social attitudes, little on the culture of the working people of the state. This seems to me to be a situation worth remedying. Now, the effort to rescue some of the common people from the oblivion of posterity can be exemplified very briefly, by reference to three episodes, rather small episodes in some ways, in South Australian history in the middle of the 19th century. My first example taken from South Australian history is that of Benjamin Boyce. And the reason for this is that by freakish chance, three of Benjamin Boyce's letters have survived. Letters written in Adelaide in 1842 to 1846, and they're now to be found in the archives, or copies of them are to be found in the South Australian archives. Benjamin Boyce was a semi-literate labouring man. He arrived in Adelaide on Boxing Day 1839 aboard the migrant vessel, the Moffat, anchored from London with 307 passengers. And Boyce was not a migrant, but a member of the crew of the Moffat. And on board the Moffat, he met a girl called Louise, who eventually he married. At Glenelg, Boyce jumped ship, and then lived a fugitive existence in the outlying areas of Adelaide for several months as a runaway sailor. A reward of £2 was put on his capture, but he remained in hiding, living on fish, presumably in a Crusoe-like existence for a couple of months. And only when the vessel Moffat sailed away, did Boyce come out of hiding and then to the club in a dairy of Joseph Barrett, employment which lasted for 3 months. Now, labour at that point was in great demand in Adelaide, and the inflationary prospects were very buoyant in the city. Now, Boyce set himself up, as a result of these favourable conditions, cutting hay in the city of Adelaide on government land and selling it on his own account. Not long after this, however, unfortunately, the first boom of South Australian economic history collapsed, and Boyce retreated to the hills where he cut timber and constructed rough houses and fences. And he joined partnership with an ex-convict who happened to hail from Boyce's own village back in Lincolnshire. This was a man called William Holland, who had been transported to Van Diemen's Land 14 years earlier. And they both managed to accumulate a little money to increase their operations and to allow Benjamin Boyce to marry his shipboard girlfriend, who was illiterate, as is shown by the marriage certificate. Now, Boyce's letters are remarkable because they're very vivid descriptions of the life and attitudes of the working man who not normally have left any literary remains whatsoever. They describe exotic colonial South Australia to his relatives back home in darkest Lincolnshire. They're written in unself-conscious, almost phonetic English, full of earthy vigour, and the speech patterns of his day and of his social class. They're direct and spontaneous and indicate his response to, for example, local Aborigines, the isolation of colonial life, his response to his employers, one of whom swindled him, and most of all, his response to the opportunities of life in South Australia compared with contemporary Lincolnshire. He was obviously extremely homesick, but he was prepared to recommend to his relatives, his friends back home in Lincolnshire, that they emigrate. I am sure, he said, I quote, I am sure that if labouring people had the least idea of the colony, they would not work hard in England to starve, where in the colonies there is plenty. For we have plenty of wheat and mutton and beef and everything that one can wish for. The only thing is a crossing the salt water. Fear of the sea, the oceans, and the distance was a great psychological impediment to migrants. For Boyce told his people back home not to be afraid, I quote again, to go from the smoke of your mother's chimney, and chided them for being afraid to leave home. Altogether, these letters of Boyce have a realism and a resonance that's extremely convincing. They demonstrate the realities of colonial life for 90% of the early migrants to South Australia. Boyce, I think, deserves to be set beside those grave and worthy men of capital and social status, the men of business enterprise and constitution makers of the South Australian colony. Boyce is an indispensable dimension, it seems to me, of our image of the colonial past. And I think he's so interesting because it's extremely rare to find a man of the working class expressing himself directly in this manner. Well, my second little episode concerns the Scottish Highlanders in South Australia. They're mainly remembered because they constituted a social problem at the time. And conventionally, I think, they would be regarded from the viewpoint of the civic authorities who were faced with a real problem of what to do about them. I'm talking about a party of Scottish Highlanders who arrived in Port Adelaide in September 1855. There were 30 families, a total of 147 people. And they'd been recruited from the Isle of Skye, where when the demand for labour in South Australia had been very high. But, very sadly, when they arrived in Adelaide, sometime later, the demand for labour had gone off the boil. The labour market had become glutted. In Adelaide, the authorities feared the creation of a semi-permanent pauper problem. And the Highlands were then shunted off to Robe, where it was hoped local agriculture would absorb them into employment there. But in fact, the Robe area was already overstocked with migrant labour. And in conditions of extreme heat, the Highlanders were accommodated under tarpaulin tents, and eventually some were lost employment. The health of those remaining deteriorated inevitably. One died of consumption, 2 boys died of village fever, it was all in a few months. Then another father of 4 died of also of fever. One of the men became deranged, and one can only guess at the mental state of the several widows left behind at that point. There are several other points about these people that emerge from this rather tragic event. Firstly, they were obviously refugees from the grip of 2 devastating circumstances back in Scotland. One was the potato famine, as it gets, and the other was the rapacious attitude of the landlord in the Isle of Skye, who cleared them off their land straight on to the migrant ships. Secondly, these people were deeply attached to their family connections, and while employers wanted to split them up to get cheap male single labour, they refused to be dispersed from their family groups. Thirdly, they only spoke Gaelic, and they found Australia alien in totality from their own Highland background and culture. Fourthly, they were peasants, whose most important desire, as is typical peasants, was for land. And they had expected, very clearly, they expected to get land in the Australian colonies when they arrived. And they sent a petition to the governor of South Australia at that time, begging for enough land for each family to live by, so they could live by their own labours and live as a highly community with its own particular Presbyterian religion. The response to this pathetic petition was negative. The Bill plan of the colony was expressly designed to prevent labouring immigrants from getting land quickly. I think the Wakefieldian system of land dispersal will sometimes be seen from the point of view of labour as much as from the view of capital and the landlord. It's only possible to reconstruct the experience of these people out of the fragments of evidence that survived from immigration records, the petitions, newspaper reports, proceedings of the Immigration Society. Nevertheless, they are important, for they represent an ethnic minority, in effect, in an Anglo-Saxon world, and their reception tells us much about the nature of colonial society in South Australia. My third group really will be part of women's history from below. It's about some Irish girls. At the same time, much the same time as the Highlanders came to South Australia, there arrived in Adelaide a very large number of single Irish girls. In December 1854, 1,044 arrived, and in the next 9 months, another 2,047 single Irish girls arrived. They were also regarded as a social problem by the authorities. It was very difficult to find employment for them, and they were regarded as a threat to morality, because it was found very difficult to confine them to migrant barracks during the night time. At one point, they had to be subdued by the Adelaide fire engine, which is Well, eventually, after many months, the Irish girls were dispersed throughout the colony to Clare, Under, Grove, Encounter Bay, Gawler, Wollonga, and Yankalilla. And nowadays, it's extremely difficult to find any trace whatever of their settlement. Yet at the time, it must have seemed like a flood of Irishness descending on the colony. For instance, 121 of these Irish girls descended on the minute township then of Clare in 1855. If we look more closely at the circumstances of this immigration, it leads us, I think, to interesting conclusions about both Ireland and South Australia. These Irish girls were peasantry. They were prepared to do manual labour, not merely ornamental duties. It was said by some of the colonists that they were quite unsuitable for respectable domestic service, and therefore likely to become prostitutes. They were fit only for farm service, said some. Secondly, they were Catholic. And this immediately made them suspect in many eyes, because some influential South Australians wished to keep the colony purely Protestant. Thirdly, the girls, like the Highlanders, were refugees from famine in Ireland. Fourthly, they suffered from the inordinate deficiency of husbands back in Britain. This was a time, the 1850s, when men were marrying less and they were marrying later, and they tended to emigrate more so than women. And therefore there was a deficiency of men. This reflected in the singleness of many women. Fifthly, employment opportunities for single women were extremely narrow in Britain in the mid-19th century. The semi-slavery of domestic service was the biggest single occupational group in Victorian Britain. It was not sufficient to soak up the vast numbers of unemployed single women at that time. Thus, if we examine a small subgroup in the population from below, it can tell us quite a lot about the structure and character of that society and widen our understanding of the social conflict. Moreover, if we ignore the current people, we miss half the variety and significance of social processes. I think it needs to be said that history from below is technically very difficult, and it requires all the gifts of interpretation and analysis that the historian is able to muster. Despite these difficulties, it may be said that the achievements of history from below are already substantial, notably in the history of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and social conflict in 18th and 19th century Britain. I think its role beyond this fairly limited territory is of great potential, and that it would be best advanced in conjunction with some of the new style of social history which is emerging concurrently with history from below. I refer specifically to the study of social history as the study of society, of social structures and social processes over historical time. The concern of many social historians is now to interpret the character and texture of social life as a fundamental prerequisite from understanding the nature of society in terms of its power structure, its values, and its direction. And this is reflected, I think, in the kinds of questions that are now being asked. And I can list some of these. Things like family occupational patterns, religious behaviour, marriage patterns, the sport, school experience, and subjective views of social class, the impact of urbanisation, and so on. We need to ask how it was that a large part of the lower class in history has accepted the prevailing social hierarchy and their own relative deprivation. A recent survey of working class documents in Britain of the 19th century comes to the conclusion, interestingly, that there's generally little business, little recrimination from these documents concerned with people's place in the social hierarchy and their own relative deprivation. Now, all this requires a study of history of the people and their experience. Moreover, the sources of documentation are often available. For instance, in South Australia, I think you could say, local historians are quite well supplied in this respect. On housing, for instance, there are censuses, and municipal and building society records. On morbidity, there are hospital files. On popular religion, there are city mission reports and many other sources. On wages and conditions, there are factory reports and records. On marriage patterns, there are, of course, the church and civil registers. On deviant behaviour and crime, there are legal records. On mental health, there are and health records, there are hospital and asylum reports. And on status, pride and prejudice, we may turn to novelists, folklorists, and to the oral tradition. Now, these questions are interesting in their own right, I think, but of course, I think they have a much wider potential in that they lead us towards an understanding of social identities and social mechanisms. As F.B. Smith has remarked, the social history of the common people can provide, I quote, insights into social mechanisms which we little understand, such as the relation between ill health and political passivity, physical tiredness and social compliance, hunger and class envy. Taken together, these sorts of questions will constitute a very large part of the puzzle of how a society holds itself together and evolves over time. These questions define the context of social change, and more particularly the limits of political action. It seems to me quite obvious that we cannot understand history as society without properly taking cognizance of this wider context. As an American historian has written, it is the common people acting in roughly congruent patterns, bearing children, building the economy, and creating through their own behaviour, a set of ideological principles, offering or withholding their allegiance to institutions or governments. So these things that determine the development of society. And he said that vital fact has too often gone unnoticed. We can go further than this and say that the historian is very well employed in seeking to interpret and discover those elements of social change as part of the collective self-knowledge of that society. It will help society, and especially common people, to make sense of the social process, to see better the directions that they have been taking. It becomes, in effect, people's history. One historian has indeed predicted that the 20th century will become the century in which the history of the common man, and not seen through the eyes of the betters, but drawn out of the workaday records of the past, becomes a major part of historical work. There will become a democratization of the past. Thus, the new social history will pay much more regard both to the common man and to sociology. And George Roudet has gone further than this, and he sees the dawn of mass history with the aid of computers, I'm afraid, which might one day permit a close observation of the nation as a whole, he says. And there is wide support for this interpenetration of history and sociology in pursuit of long-run changes in the social structure. It's my hope that the impact of sociology will be tempered and humanized and balanced by the contribution of history from below as such. This leaves me with the gritty, rather residual problem of the ideological bias that might be suspected of history from below. Is it not the case, for instance, that history from below will be heavily populated by left-wing historians, sympathetic to certain kinds of doctrinal interpretation, colouring, and judging each historical event in terms of the approved line of Labour evolution? I think there are several answers to this worry, and it's a real worry. Firstly, no history is objective in any final sense, and all brands of historians should be self-conscious and explicit about their own ideological standpoints. Secondly, I think it's perfectly possible to imagine a conservative or a Whig variety of history from below, which could be equally one-eyed. For example, such a bias would stress the conservative character of proletarian attitudes during certain periods. The historical Alf Garnett might tend to predominate alarmingly in that kind of view of history. Certainly many historians in the field are already aware of the problem and its possibilities. For instance, Edward Thompson has pointed out that Horatio Bottomley was, after all, as influential in his time as Ernest Bevin, and historians, he says, cannot turn a blind eye to working class or even Fabian sins. And there are great areas of working class life which need to be placed in perspective. For instance, the working class Tory, church and king voters, strikebreakers, Tory Chartists, and the many stalwarts of the conservative working men's clubs, in Britain particularly. Not to mention so many working class wives who shared little solidarity with the political aims of many Labour leaders. So these people are obviously part of the story, and a very large part of the story, it seems to me. It's a movement away, in fact, from the view that only militant left-wing conduct is worth studying in terms of working class history. So I think, therefore, the problem of ideological bias in history from below is of fairly small importance. And personally, I want to subscribe to the view of Eric Hobsbawm that at all costs the historian should avoid confusing the ideological or political motivation of research with its scientific value. Historians from below should be judged by the results rather than by the politics of the practitioners. As Sir Karl Popper says, the origin of a proposition is irrelevant to its truth or falsehood. And by this dictum, it seems to me, we return to the quality of historical scholarship, to the respect for evidence and internal logic. In fact, we return to all those tasks of interpretation and historical imagination which accompany the effort to make the inarticulate of history speak and live. And finally, absolutely finally, I would like to recruit two distinguished and unlikely allies who unconsciously advocated history from below. One was none other than Dr. Samuel Johnson in 1775, and I quote him, that the true state of every nation is the state of common life, the people in the streets, in the villages, in the shops, and in the farms. For them must like measure of general prosperity be taken. From those people must the general measure be taken. And my second ally in all this, unconsciously, is Leo Tolstoy. I quote Tolstoy saying, to study the laws of history, we must completely change the subject of our observation. We must leave aside kings, ministers, and generals, and study the common, infinitesimally small elements by which the masses are moved. Well, this is the way to write history, according to Tolstoy, and I think today many people are beginning to agree with this conception of the writing of history.
Extremely interesting.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll call upon Mr. Colin Deaton to brief me to thank Dr. Danny. Mr. Deaton is President of the History Teachers Association of South
I
Australia.
need some of that elements of South
Well, there's no
Australia.
better way on occasions such as this to illustrate the balance that we hope to have within the Historical Society than to have Dr. Richards show us how the academic can give us a perspective and a context into which to see our work on the local field. And certainly as a start of that, he helps remind us of the fact that we can sometimes be somewhat parochial. Well, having inherited a bit of parochialism while residing on Kangaroo Island for a few years, I couldn't help but feel that History from Below was going to announce publicly for the first time that South Australia was settled from down there and not John Tregenza. So I was teaching on Kangaroo Island. I did become somewhat frustrated at the lack of material available for students who were trying to learn about the local area. Trying to do my best, I found a certain amount of help through the National Trust and a certain amount of help through the archives, but it certainly cried out for an organisation of this sort which could help put teachers, in this particular case, in contact with other people working in the field of history. And so, particularly on behalf of the History Teachers Association, I'd like to welcome and congratulate the formation of the Society and to indicate to you the number of history teachers who are also interested, just by their very presence here tonight for a start. For the history teacher is very mindful of the fact that perhaps nothing has done more to damage the image of history to the general public than some history teaching in the past. And as part of this mindfulness, we've
we're very anxious to make the history which is presented to students in the schools as lively as that history which most of you have discovered probably once you have left school. So it's with great pleasure that I join in the people who first of all are supporting the formation of the society. More particularly, Dr. Eric Richards. And joining with him in his pointing out that we're looking at the history of the inarticulate. Well, as teachers, we are very much working to make the inarticulate a little more articulate. Dr. Eric Richards also points out that history from below has come basically as a reaction from the old. Well, with the assistance of the Historical Society, perhaps history teachers too can help react against the old and promote the new. Thank you very much, Dr. Richards. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my particular pleasure to welcome to this meeting the President of the Royal Australian Historical Society, the Honourable Mr. Justice R. Mitchell. I want to thank him very particularly on behalf of this meeting for making a very prodigious and determined effort to attend this meeting. I think the account that one could write, the history that one could write, our contacts and our attempts to arrange Justice Mitchell's attendance here themselves might fill at least the first of the proceedings of this society. And knowing that he has had an extremely busy day in Melbourne today, that he arrived indeed 10 minutes after this meeting began at Adelaide Airport, and that he's now been safely deposited in our midst, it gives me particular pleasure to welcome him and to ask him to speak to us rather briefly, but certainly with a great deal of pleasure, I'm sure, on his part, because I know his interest in this field for this meeting. The Honourable Justice R. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, for inviting me to be with you on the occasion of the launching of the Historical Society of South Australia. And I should first like to bring to you the greetings and good wishes of the Royal Australian Historical Society, because it welcomes to the fold, as it were, the last state in Australia that hasn't had an historical society identifying its work with the state as a whole. The Royal Australian Historical Society, I suppose, in one sense, sails under false colours, because despite its name, it is primarily the Historical Society that's concentrated upon New South Wales and operates from the city of Sydney. But we do feel that because of its origin, almost commencing with the time of Federation, it has some claim to the name that it bears. And so I say on its behalf and to all of you, Mr. President, welcome, greetings, and may your society sail along without too many troubled waters and achieve the objectives that are set out on the leaflet that has been distributed tonight. I'm sorry I didn't hear the whole of Dr. Richards' address, but sufficient of it I did hear to say, if I might, how much I appreciate his observations. And of course, I suppose history from below can embrace also the activities of those societies that have as a function the study of history at grassroots. Dr. Richards was thinking in terms of below in the sense of social class and as something in opposition or antithesis to elitism. But I suppose the local history that you will come to find an absorbing matter for study on the part of some of your members and local branches that I hope you will establish represents another sort of history from below. History from the grassroots, history from the districts and the outlying areas where you can see at close quarters by study how the pioneers lived, how they brought up their families and how they made an impact on conquering the harsh terrain and countryside that to many of them was so foreign and different from the places whence they migrated. Now may I risk of being accused of quoting a elitist, namely Sir Paul Hazlitt, who is not of course a South Australian, say that the study of history today, a generation of new consciousness about Australian history, as becoming something very different from what it was 20, 30 or 40 years ago. It used to be said of the society of which I'm president of New South Wales that it was primarily a society devoted to antiquarian interests. And indeed, not only did we keep a historical museum, but when we went on excursions at the weekend, we took some of our ancient exhibits with us. Ladies and gentlemen who had reached octogenarian status. But there is a change, and it is so gratifying to see in the audience here tonight so many people who do not approach the octogenarian range or even half of that. But Sir Paul Hazlitt said, and he said this at the opening of History House in Sydney in 1972, he said, "As I travel around Australia, I find there is a growing interest on the part of Australians, and particularly Australians of the younger age groups, in their own past. It is a deep searching interest in the past. They are not satisfied with the quick and romantic story. The younger Australians of today, in all parts of Australia, are becoming interested in what sort of a place Australia is, how it came to be that sort of a place, why we have grown up in this way and not in some other way. They want to know more about what we are and how we came to be that way. Nationalism in Australia," he said, "is today perhaps more fervent than it ever has been before in our history. A very strong and fervent nationalism. But it is not a nationalism that is just satisfied with being proud. It wants to know what we've got to be proud about." And that the mood of new interest, real interest in Australia and their past, he said that we are seeking a greater understanding of ourselves, an account of the life we live, an account free of all fantasy, free of all romantic legend, and one that will help us find out truly what sort of people we are. Part of it, he thought, arose from a very great current discontent, particularly among younger people, with the glib explanation. There is discontent in the community. They are not taking the easy way, the easy answer in the way they used to, not accepting the legend. And I suppose I could remind you of what Russell Ward has said in this connection. They are not believing something simply because Mother told it to us, and so it must be right and should be believed and acted upon. There is a great discontent with the easy explanation, and luckily amongst some of the best of our younger generation, it is leading to a search for a greater understanding of what we really are and a greater awareness about ourselves. And I suppose that's another way of saying that history from below is a rewarding subject for study by an historical society. I congratulate you, ladies and gentlemen, on having taken the step you have in forming this society. I look forward to mutual interchange of ideas between your society and the others in Australia, and particularly my own New South Wales. I look forward to seeing some of you when you come to Sydney, and you'll be welcome at History House in Macquarie Street to see what we have to offer and perhaps to help you in some respects. And we look forward in turn to some sort of reciprocal advantage and benefit from your work. We look forward in due time, and I don't know whether one can be prophetic on this, to some sort of union, alliance or federation between the historical societies of the 6 states in Australia. Because now, when we have a family of 6, we may be in a position with some solidarity to extract from those denizens of finance and capital something that will be a subsidy to help historical societies in the valuable work of research and publishing that they must undertake. We are fortunate in New South Wales to be receiving fairly substantial subsidies from the state government. We're hoping to receive, we've had promised something from Commonwealth government. We hope you will be able to do the same with your own government, and I hope that with the representation of 6 societies we may be in a position to extract at Commonwealth level something that can be distributed throughout the 6 states to the advantage of the societies in all those states and to the advantage of the study of Australian history, the publication of the results of your research and so on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm glad I got here, even if it was 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour late. I'm glad, Dr. Richards, to have heard the substantial part of your paper, to have understood the thesis that you're advocating, and may I, on behalf of my society and personally, wish you and your society every success in the future.